this live. What I thought I'd talk about today is leadership, or perhaps more correctly, our response to leadership. It is, after all, in the UK at least, a day that a lot of people are aware of because it is Guy Fawkes Day, soon to be Guy Fawkes Night. And of course, Guy Fawkes is well known for having a bit of an issue with those people who were in power 400 plus years ago. And that is a bit extreme. I'm not advising that at all. But not only is it Guy Fawkes Night, we also have a situation where in the US, the presidential election is about to be, decided, because the votes will soon be in and they will have been counted, and we'll find out who has won. And the build up to that result has been intriguing, to say the least. And I'll maybe talk about that, irrespective of who you hope to win. Maybe it's both, maybe it's neither. But irrespective of that, I'll mention it, and I'm not going to be partisan in what I'm talking about, because I guess really what is important to me in terms of sharing with you is to consider how we're influenced and to consider who we should vote for and or follow. I'm not specifically talking about politicians. It's just interesting that on this day, we're soon, probably by tomorrow, we're soon to find out the result of the American elections, and also it is Guy Fawkes Day. And we're led potentially in many different areas of our lives. Obviously, politicians are on people's minds right now, but it could be leaders in business, it could be leaders in the community, it could be spiritual leaders, it could be leaders of faith, it could be leaders in terms of thinking, thought leaders, it could be leaders in different areas of the community. And so leadership is a thing which has been around for as long as people have been around. You yourself may be a leader. And as I've said before, I think we are all leaders. We can lead ourselves, and we can lead by example and make a difference out there in the world. And what I want to draw your attention to are a few little experiments that have taken place over the years and are quite famous, to illustrate the need for each and every one of us to be discerning in terms of who we follow. Leadership doesn't exist without followership. Self-leadership, yeah, that can exist on its own, and I would strongly encourage everyone to think about leading themselves, creating a life where they are aware of their own agency and practice heading towards goals, and on that journey towards goals, gather up the tools, the strategies, the techniques, and the ideas that can allow them to be more resilient and to fend off those things that can weaken us, that can drain our energy. And there's a lot more to be said about self-leadership. I've talked about it before, and I'll talk about it again. But beyond self-leadership, structural leadership, societal leadership, corporate leadership requires followers. Even a thought leader, one could argue strongly, I would suggest, requires followers. Because if someone is considered to be a thought leader, then generally people have heard the thoughts of this thought leader. They are considered, they are talked about, they are perhaps copied in many ways. And even if the thought leader is no longer with us, then that thought leader still has followers. You've probably seen this yourself. People adhere to their doctrine, their ideas, their philosophy. And that's not a bad thing necessarily at all. It could be if the ideas are toxic and lead people along the wrong ethical and moral paths, at least in my opinion, I think that's not a good thing. But by and large, people will have followers because they're doing something which attracts those followers. But that's something that attracts them, just like the potentially toxic leader. Well, we could fall for it. We've got to be, as I've said, discerning. And so these bits of research from the past, and I call them bits of research, that's a little bit dismissive, because they are important pieces of research. They are talking pieces. They're generally quite well known. And I want to talk about each of them and discuss how that could give us a clue to help us be more discerning about who we follow, who we believe, in essence, who we trust, in essence, who we decide to support, in essence. That's what I mean by following. Whose ideas we take on board and copy, live a life according to these ideas. That's also what I mean by following, and also what I mean by discernment, because there are people that we shouldn't, and there are traps that are out there that we need to avoid, and there are areas in our lives where, if we're not careful, we could be following people, individuals, doctrines, creeds, parties, groups that are not that good for us. So let's talk about some of these. And some of these, let's say, they're not thought experiments exactly, they're psychological experiments which can and did create situations where people's ability to think was influenced. So beginning with, and you may well have heard of this one, the Stanford prison experiment. That was Philip Zimbardo, who passed away quite recently, aged 91. There was a movie about the Stanford prison experiment, but it wasn't entirely accurate. It was there was some dramatic license in there, and that's okay. But if you've watched the movie, then that's not exactly what happened. And also exactly what happened has been a source of investigation for quite some time, because it turned out it wasn't quite as people thought. But essentially, if you haven't heard of it, the Stanford prison experiment, I think it was the 1950s, and Zimbardo set this up so that students were employed to take part in the experiment. And some students were asked to be, well, essentially the people who would be taken into custody, and other people would act, I think initially a couple acted as police, but were going to act as guards in this jail. And what happened was, quite quickly the experiment got out of hand, because the jailers, the guards, effectively became ever more cruel, and those people who were to be the prisoners became ever more distressed. It is suggested that one student who was playing the role of a prisoner feigned some mental health crisis to get out of it. I don't think people realised that at the time. And ultimately, the guards became so cruel that a halt was called to the experiment. And legend has it that the person who called it out was not Zimbardo himself. In fact, it is reported that Zimbardo was actually beginning to relish how cruel the guards were being. Perhaps some people suggest he wasn't relishing, he was allowing it to continue, however, to the point where it was damaging. It wasn't ethical, it wasn't moral. You know, the guards were getting the prisoners, inverted commas, to, you know, clean things in a way that was cruel. They weren't allowed to leave the rooms. There was all sorts of stuff going on that became brutal and was brutalizing the prisoners. And it was Zimbardo's partner, girlfriend at the time, and I think later his wife, who said, "You need to stop. This isn't ethical, it isn't moral, it's cruel, it's heartless. What are you doing? Snap out of it. You've gotten so focused on allowing this experiment to continue to get some kind of outcome that you've lost a sense of perspective. Now, initially this experiment was reported as how quickly people could adopt the roles that they were put within. They could become helpless, they could feel terrorized. These were the prisoners, even although they knew it was fake, even although they knew it was part of a university psychological experiment. And the guards could become far crueler than they should have been. They shouldn't have been at all. And quite vindictive, it is reported, knowing that this was just role play. They went beyond role play, far beyond it, into, again, unethical and immoral behavior, cruelty. But apparently, history seems to relay these days that having, these are some authorities, some specialists in the area, having investigated what Zimbardo was up to, it would seem, and I'm only reporting because I can't say for certain, I wasn't there, but it would seem that Zimbardo had briefed the prison guards in terms of how to behave. He had essentially said, you know, yeah, just push the boundaries. You want to be a little bit out there in terms of what you might be asking these prisoners to do, just do it. Just you do what you want. And so he was encouraging this cruelty, if I could call it that. As far as I'm aware, from initially thinking that this was an experiment that showed how people just dropped into these roles, it became something a little bit more, let's say, filled with subterfuge than that, because Zimbardo was sort of stoking the fire. However, I think what it shows is exactly how a need to get an outcome, a need to have something happen in a way that an individual wanted it to happen, when they were in power, can corrupt. And the one corrupted, in my opinion, based on what I'm aware of right now, having read the research around the investigation into what Zimbardo did, was Zimbardo himself. He was corrupted. He was in charge of the whole thing. And he went too far. And he went too far because he broke the ethical boundaries. He ignored the morality of it. He wanted the result that he wanted. And to do that, he dipped over into not behaving in a manner that a leader should behave, but certainly a researcher should behave, and certainly someone of his intelligence and caliber should behave, because he wanted that outcome. And so is it an example, I should say, of ultimate power ultimately corrupting? I don't know. I think that's a bit twee. I think it's a bit easy to say that. But I think it is an example of someone who was in charge and who wanted something so much that he ignored the suffering of people around him. Now, it's useful also to put this into context. That experiment did not run for very long. This wasn't something that was on for weeks or months, you know, hours, days, and then a halt was called from someone close to Zimbardo, but not him. But it does, I think, also show how quickly people who are in a position of influence can cause suffering, and also how those boundaries, as I've said already, between what is right and what isn't can be blurred and ultimately crossed into something which ultimately I think was a bit evil. If the findings of people who investigated the Stanford prison experiment latterly are to be believed, and as far as I can make out, yes, Zimbardo was complicit in cranking up the cruelty. And so he was the one that demonstrated unwittingly, in many ways, what he was trying to show, which is that if you're put in a position and you're given some power, you can do wrong. Anyway, maybe he did that. Maybe he knowingly did it. Who knows? But it's oft quoted, but I think it's quoted slightly incorrectly, as I've suggested. So we've got the Zimbardo one, the concept that being in a position of power can cause one to dehumanize, or to think of others as the others, otherizing them, theming them. So it becomes us, the elite, the ones in power, and them. And we don't need Zimbardo or the Stanford Prison Experiment, however slightly murky the methodology was, to allow us to see that. It is everywhere. You've probably seen this yourself. It's so easy for people to get into a room and get into a group and think of themselves as a little bit different. We can see also in the UK that certainly so far the present government, the incumbent government, have disappointed a lot of people, and that's putting it mildly. And I think one of the reasons is because they purported to be the people who were of the people. They were these socially aware and supportive individuals that understood the pain and weren't like these other individuals, the Tories, that they shouted at and screamed at. And there are so many things coming out which just further enhance this feeling of an elite and the plebs. And I don't think that's gone away. But I think for a lot of people, the disappointment has been greater because they appeared, on the surface at least, to not be like that. So we don't have to look far to see people in power beginning to think that they are something a little bit different, that the rules may not apply to them. And of course, it isn't just the present government in the UK. I've mentioned the government before them. You can see it in a lot of different places. You can see it in corporations. You can see it on boards. You can see it with the executive teams. So the fact that there is this propensity, this capacity, this perhaps even almost habitual process that people go through, that when they are in a position of power and influence, that it's something that's almost like a fait accompli. I don't actually believe that it is, but one could get into the space of becoming almost despondent and cynical about it. And I don't want to imply that we should be, but I think we have to be a little bit wary, hence this video, and I'll come on to some other things. So hence the discernment about being a follower. We have to not necessarily presume that everything will be fine. We have to be aware that this capacity for people to get into thinking that they are the elite, thinking that they are something special, thinking that the rules don't apply, is real, and it can happen. It won't always happen, but it can. It's not going to be, hopefully, at least to the same extent as the Zimbardo Stanford Prison Experiment, but it is something that appears to be easy. There is the capacity to do it if we are not careful. Which is why I keep on saying we need accountability, we need transparency, and we must have people who are communicating clearly, and we also need humility within leaders. Now, what else is there in terms of experiments, research that we can look at, which can help guide us in terms of how discerning we need to be about who we should follow, and even in following, who we should potentially be questioning? Well, a couple of other things spring to mind. One is the Stanley Milgram experiment. So this is the one that you may be aware of, where people were brought in under the auspices of helping with an experiment, but what they were actually asked to do was to turn the voltage up. So if you're just remembering that one, yeah, that one. And in the room next door were people who were going to be given a mild electric shock. And to cut a long story short, the people who were taking part in the experiment were asked to increase the voltage again and again and again. And at a certain point, it was painful, and then painful and dangerous. And the person who was in charge, the important bit here being the authority figure, then said, no, it's okay, it will be fine, just turn this up a little bit more into the danger zone, yes, please do that. And quite a few people in that experiment did that, even although in some versions of it, they could hear screams. They could hear cries of pain, allegedly from the person next door who was receiving the shock. And of course, if you haven't heard of that experiment, I should explain that there was no one receiving the shock. It was all made up. It was, in some cases, in some versions of it, a recording. In other versions, somebody acting and pretending in the room next door. Now, you may have heard that this was something that people did blindly, but it wasn't. Not everyone obeyed the authority figure. And also, a criticism of that experiment was that it was set decades ago when people, it is argued, were more likely to blindly obey someone who was cast as an authority figure. And I think to add drama to it, the authority figure, the scientist type, would be wearing a lab coat. And so they were told by this expert, it's safe, it's fine, please do it. Are you sure? I don't really want to do it. I feel uncomfortable about this. No, do it. And they did. But again, there is nuance in all of these research experiments. And part of that nuance was that not everyone did it. Some people said no, but more people than one would think did it. If you consider it, in actual fact, no one should have been putting that dial to danger, pain. They all should have been, by and large, morally and ethically obliged not to. But of course, in the moment, they're being told it's okay, this is an authority figure, and some people would do it. And let me skip back as well to mention Stanford and then Stanley Milgram, because both of those research experiments we can look at and think that wouldn't be me. If I was in power, I wouldn't get corrupted by it. I wouldn't let it go in my head. I wouldn't begin to think that I was special. If I was the person faced with the expert who was telling me to turn that dial up, I wouldn't do it. I would say, no, this is wrong. Well, hopefully we wouldn't do anything like that in either of those situations, the Zimbardo one or the Milgram one. But we can't say for certain. When there's pressure like that on, then I will direct your attention to the Solomon Asch conformity experiment. And this one has been repeated again in different ways. And in its sort of base format, there were a group of people in a room who were hired. They were essentially actors, and they were tasked with deciding which lines on a bit of paper were the closest match to another line. So just literally a drawn line on paper. The group were actors, but one individual was asked to come into this room, and they were also given the same task. But the actors, being actors, again, people who were briefed about the experiment, were given a script. And the script was, in different versions of this little test, with a different person, an individual who knew nothing of the experiment, who came in. Let's say there were 10 actors in the room and the 11th person knew nothing about it. In some occasions, the 11th person would come in and the experimenter would say, which of these lines on the bit of paper, let's say there were 4 lines, matches this other line. And sometimes the 10 actors would say, well, this one, and that would be the correct answer. So that's fine. But sometimes the 10 actors would say, well, it's line B. Now, the 11th person, who hadn't been briefed, who was just told, this is something I'd like you to help us out with, they looked at the line and thought, well, it's not B. B is like way too long or way too short. It's obviously line C that this separate piece of paper is closest to. In fact, it's an exact match. What are these people talking about? This is crazy. And what happened was that quite a few times, the person who knew that the length of the line was wrong, just agreed. In other words, they conformed. Solomon Asch conformity experiment. They conformed. They looked around and went, well, yeah, it's B. B. So the whole room, 11 people, then said it was B, which was quite patently wrong. Of course, the reason it happened is because 10 people said it's B, and this individual, thinking that it wasn't B, that was C or whatever, just agreed. Once more, it wasn't everyone. Once more, it was but a larger percentage than one might expect. So when I mentioned that sometimes the experiment was run and the 10 actors would give the answer of the correct line, this line over here matches C, absolutely correct. And so the 11th person was in alignment, and they did that to show that it is likely that the agreement isn't something to do with somebody just disagreeing with the 10 other people. There wasn't something else going on there. So I think there was like 0 point something of a discrepancy with that. And in other words, occasionally someone would come in and would disagree, but it was a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the number of people that they tested. And I think, if memory serves, in some versions of this experiment that I've seen, the percentage was something like 60 odd percent disagreed. So they said, no, I don't agree with these other 10 people, it's this line. So if you've heard somebody say, and every time everyone agreed with the 10 other actors, as far as I understand it, that's not true. But that means there was about, 20, 30 at times percent of people who did agree because they needed to conform. And of course, what is happening in that situation, people are saying to themselves, well, I don't want a hard time. I want to fit in. I don't want to step outside of the herd, of the crowd, because I'm going to look stupid, or maybe they know something that I don't. So it is kind of understandable. I don't think there's anything really peculiar going on here, and I don't think it was because there was some weird sort of psychological pressure on them. I think it's pretty obvious. I mean, what would you do? Maybe you've been in situations like that where somebody said, no, it's the red ball over there, and you think, I thought it was the green one. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I've missed out something. All these people seem to be saying the red one. Okay, red. And why would that happen? Because of herd instinct. Animals are protected when they move in herds from the apex predator. So they don't want to be outside of the tribe. There's this old adage that people say, in terms of public speaking, many people would rather face some really harsh endeavor than have to talk in public, and some of the rationale that is suggested behind that is because we're tribal. If we get separated from the tribe way back when, hundreds of thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, even these days, if we get separated from the tribe, we're vulnerable to the predator. And so when we stand to talk in public and people can judge us, we may get judged harshly, and we may therefore get shunned, as the Amish say, or is it Amish, but I think it's Amish. And that being the case, then if we're shunned by the tribe, we're vulnerable. We can't protect ourselves. So we want to be in the tribe. We want to belong. And so I think it's understandable that in a situation where a lot of people are saying, no, it's line B, or it's the red ball, that people would hesitate and go, okay, I'll just agree with that. But the problem with that is life can throw us up some curveballs, red or green. The line can suddenly not be straight at all. It's a little bit more complex than that. And we can find ourselves in situations where the crowd, not necessarily everyone, of course, most of the time it won't be, unlike the experiment, the majority or big groups of people are saying one thing. And we've got to be careful about whether we're swayed or not. And if you think about it, we have situations where we have crowds of people saying one thing, but what is the truth? So to recap so far, we have this idea that people in power, but not everyone, if they do not practice an element of curiosity and remaining humble and dialing down the ego, can become, to a degree, influenced by that power, and the group that they exist within can become, let's say, changed to the point where they think there's something special, they become the elite, and everyone else is there who is less than. And I've seen this in so many different ways, time and time and time again, which is why I always talk about, in terms of leadership development, that it's leader development, it's development of self in any sphere, in life, but in particular, in this instance, when someone is put in a position of authority, which is why we've got to look at the character of individuals alongside their knowledge and experience, with character requiring much more of a focus than it is currently given. Anyway, so we have to be aware that when people get into these positions, it could change them. But more likely, what is the track record of this individual before they got there? And has that given us some clues? Because often, but not always, it does. So there's an element of caution regarding those people who are in a position of power and influence. And how can we cope with that? How can we practice discernment? And I would say that one of the ways is, who do we support? Who do we encourage? Who do we vote for? Who do we then, when they get into a position of power, particularly if it's in, let's say, an organization, who do we develop? And who's on probation? And I would say that everyone is on probation all the time. In fact, the bigger the role, the more power a leader has, the greater the scrutiny and the length of probation. Permanent, it should be, if you think about it. And how do we do that? We demand openness, as I said earlier on, transparency, honesty. We need to have people who are authentic and honest and truthful, who seek the truth and tell the truth. And we've almost become inured to this not happening, to politicians ignoring the question and answering something else. We've almost become, I suppose, shall we say, complacent. I don't think that's been me. Much as I don't like to say it, you get to the point where you think, well, yeah, we just should expect that. But more and more these days, as the world is more chaotic, and the consequences of getting their own person in charge and having people in positions of influence who are just wrong in terms of their character is more and more dangerous. The consequences are far greater. And to that extent, we need to ask, we need to expect, we need all to be using our voices to say, we must know what's going on. So that, I think, can help us with that Zimbardo effect. But the other element in there then is, well, I've mentioned two other things already. So one is this concept of the Milgram experiment, where someone in authority says you should do this. So once more, we need the workings, we need the background. How did you work out that? That, you know, if you cut things, if you change things in the budget, for example, how did you go about that? And we need to know that. We probably should know it beforehand. But also, we need to be aware about so-called experts. We need to be aware. Because in terms of Milgram, you could argue that the person who's given the instructions is the expert. I think you could argue that quite strongly. That was the setup. They are the authority figure, but they are the authority figure because they are the expert. And who do we trust in terms of expertise? Because we have subject leaders, do we not? We have people who are wheeled in. Are they credentialed? What is their agenda? And what is their working? And really importantly these days, we have to have second and third and fourth opinions. The last few years, there's been a tendency to have one narrative, a tendency to have one type of expert, someone who's considered to be, well, this is the person we go to. It's so important to have differences of opinion. And if we find that we're not getting them, we need to ask for them. So as we look out there to those leaders who are around us, and those people who want to be leaders, they can position themselves as an expert, which is fine. That's great. I'm all for experts. But how is their character? What was their working? And have we seen them properly challenged, respectfully challenged? The analogy too, actually, that I'll make is one, you may see this, you've probably seen it on TV. Somebody's an expert in, I don't know, let's say maths. And then all of a sudden they're presenting a lot of programs about different subjects like biology or chemistry or whatever. Now, it may be they're also an expert in that area, but as often as not, it's just convenient because they're a face and they should present this documentary and they should talk about this stuff. But sometimes I look at it and think, no, we really should have the other person on. Why is this? Because it's convenient, because we're more likely to be relaxed and buy into it, because we know this individual. And one could argue that the message can be delivered in a way that is just as informative, perhaps. But that trend, if you take it further, is dangerous. If we listen to one person, just because they know something about this area doesn't mean that they know about another. And a different example, but flipped around a different way. You've seen this probably recently in terms of certainly the UK elections of a few months ago, but really starkly in terms of the US elections. And I think it was actually Ricky Gervais that talked about this recently, but it's something that I know I've talked about to other people, and I've heard quite a few other people mention it as well. The celebrity endorsement, where the celeb is going, you should vote for this person, you should do this. And you think, why? And it's that kind of halo effect that because they're an expert in their area, whether it's acting, whether it's singing, whether it's writing, and kudos to them for that, but it doesn't mean to say that they have a clue what they're talking about in terms of endorsing certain public people. But the media know out there that we can be swayed by that with the best intentions. Of course we can be swayed by it, which is why we've got to practice this discernment and to think, is this true? Is it logically true? Where's the evidence for this? What are you actually saying? And if these celebrities want to be put out there or want to be used, of course, by people who want the endorsement, then we have to have the capacity to have them cross-examined. Well, give us the evidence for that then. You know, you're great at your craft, but tell us then what would be the economic consequences of that. And throw in some, GDP analysis as well, and so on. Hopefully you get my drift, that we've got to be careful about that influence, which then leads me on to the last kind of, it's not exactly, I suppose it is an experiment, it was an experiment, but it was certainly social engineering, and someone that I've also talked about before, and that was Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And relatively recently, I was talking about how he became involved in convincing a lot of women to smoke, because at that point in time in the States, it was frowned upon for females to smoke in public. And there were a lot of other things that were going on that were repressive and suppressive, that were not good. And quite rightly, the 50% of the population were damn well annoyed about that and wanted to do something about it. But Bernays, working for, I think it was the American Tobacco Company, or a tobacco company, he saw an opening to boost sales when he was hired by that tobacco company. And he borrowed the phrase torches of freedom and essentially said, amidst this groundswell of pushing back on this oppression, if you smoke these, it's a torch of freedom. And of course, that's very emotive language, and it's very powerful language. So he staged a couple of things where people lit a cigarette, females who were hired, and the press were there, just as they are these days, but it wasn't digital, it's film and a bulb that goes off, but the photographs were taken and all that sort of stuff. And he got the press, he got the PR that he wanted, and sales of cigarettes went through the roof. And so Bernays, by the way, wrote a book called, surprisingly, perhaps not, propaganda. And what we see these days is propaganda. Propaganda all around. The need to influence the public. And so if we begin to put that together, let's have a think then about the need to ensure that people who are in power, like the Zimbardo experiment, are accountable. We need transparency, we should expect it, we should demand it. And let's then think about the Milgram experiment, and that it is easy to fall into the trap. It's not necessarily a trap, but it could be, so we have to be cautious of having someone who's allegedly an expert, or allegedly, probably more accurately these days, an authority figure. We must ask for second, third and fourth opinions. And when you see this in the media, and we did a couple of years ago, when other opinions were quashed and there was a narrative that was put forward that we were meant to buy into. And for me, possibly you as well, that rang some alarm bells. Where is the counter to that? And when you begin to see in the media a bias in terms of who we're meant to boo for and who we're meant to cheer for, and who is the face of L'Oreal, in other words, the expert we're meant to be following today, then my opinion, that should ring some alarm bells. We need those proper debates. I've said before that things like Question Time in the BBC, which can be really enjoyable, and I'm glad the programme's there, but it's not long enough. If you look recently, there were a couple of people on the Joe Rogan podcast, and that's what I've been shouting about for such a long time. I think that should be the way forward, not necessarily in a podcast format, but elongated, where people have the chance to discuss things and we really get to understand what they really think, because they're unguarded, because things go on for so long. It's very difficult to hide behind sound bites and, of course, PR people. So we need to be aware of those second opinions and the getting thereof. So that's Milgram. And then we had the Solomon Asch conformity experiment. The bandwagon, jump on the bandwagon or not, as the case may be. Just because a lot of people are saying this is right doesn't mean to say that it is. Just because a lot of people are saying this is true doesn't mean to say that it is. The truth is the truth, no matter how small the minority. And so once more, these things, as you may now have guessed, are all connected. We need that transparency. We need that debate. We need the expectation of debate and transparency. And we need to be able to access people who have different opinions to consider whether our minority opinion, even though it is different from the majority, may be right. The red and green ball, the longer line, the shorter line. We've got to be so cautious of that bandwagon effect. And then we have Bernays. In the mix, we've got people who want to influence our opinions by doing all of those things, by saying, even though maybe they don't really care, we're here to help, we care about you, I'm in charge, I'm going to be doing this, 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 and this. I've seen some examples of that recently, where the rhetoric does not match the behaviours, doesn't match what actually happened, which is why quite a lot of people are a little bit annoyed right now. But that is the sort of thing that we need to be, let's say, vocal about. And then if you consider not only the Milgram experiment, the expert, and then the bandwagon experiment, you can see how that can get put forward to sway us, to stop us being as discerning as we probably need to be, to stop us saying, hold on a second, that expert, they need to be challenged, just like the politicians need to be challenged in long form conversations. And even though the crowd says this, well, who paid the crowd? In other words, what's the PR? Who funded the research on this that we're being told is great, is the thing to do, is the way forward? The polls? Well, who actually devised that poll? And what was the sample population? What did it consist of? And so on. Now, you might be thinking, oh, I can't be bothered with all that. And I think, to be fair, it can seem like quite a lot of work. The overall I suppose the overarching word and the overall message for me is caution. It is discernment. It's to say to ourselves, all right, when we're faced with all this stuff, where should we not just buy in? And I would say it starts with the behaviors versus the rhetoric. It starts with just one opinion of an expert rather than more than one. And the opinion of the expert needs to be debated, as we need to have debates with people who are in charge, in power. And the puffball interviews, for example, the sycophantic pieces are disgusting, a waste of time, and we need to demand more in terms of that. The bandwagon effect, we need the capacity through various means to be able to ascertain, apprehend a different opinion, a different point of view, and not to jump on that bandwagon. And also we need to be aware that when we hear stuff and when we hear pretty much the same message that's coming from, several outlets, is that accurate? Is it true? Who's saying something different? Because that bandwagon is so easy to jump on. And I would finish off by suggesting that these days, because we have 24/7 media, and I've talked about that recently, we have access to it 24/7, that is both good and bad. It can capture our attention, but we can also use it for our benefit because there are a lot of different opinions out there. The problem, and where it is up to us, is that if we always access that which we believe and want to hear, here's another bad story about this person, here's another great story about that person, that can become an echo chamber. We're really in sort of Plato's cave. We're looking at shadows. It's not real. And finding different opinions, calmly looking at them, searching for the truth, telling ourselves the truth about us, our own biases, and also searching for it and being open to debating with someone calmly in a quest to find the truth is the way forward. And it can be difficult to do that. I'm guilty of that myself, of course. Here's another story about so-and-so. But hold on. What are other people saying who've got a different opinion? And that could be absolutely eye-opening. And because we have access to what can be used as a propaganda machine against us to hypnotize us, to give us one narrative, can also be used by us if we step back and are discerning to figure out exactly what is going on. And I come back to something I've talked about before. This is why it's so important to have free speech. And once more, the caveat is that we should not be inciting things. Absolutely not. But if we lose that ability and everything is curated on platforms to the point where you can't say anything, then it's ultimately a waste of time. And that's why I've also said it's really important to be able to meet in person, to talk to people online one-to-one or one-to groups, which isn't something which you would describe as social media. And also, therefore, important to be able to talk in person and also in groups. We need to understand, we need always to have access to those different opinions, even those opinions that we don't agree with. Otherwise, again, we're in this giant echo chamber. I'll give you an extreme example of where that might head. I don't think it will, because I think people are more and more awake to this, but you will get, I think it was, is it Meta, I think, and apologies if this is wrong, but I think one of the ideas of Meta is that you can wear these virtual reality glasses and goggles, you can set your own avatar up, you can meet other avatars, and of course this goes on just now as well, but you could ultimately live your life there. You could interact, you could shop, you could earn money, and I can see the attraction of that to a degree, but if that's the only place that you exist, then what is your reality? And who curates what is actually being said and how what you're saying is transmitted and translated? Yes, that may sound a little bit dystopian and a bit out there and a bit sci-fi, but we're not that far away, if we're not careful, from living our realities in those particular areas, in those particular cyber places. And if you have seen the other video that I made recently about the clock that was 3 minutes fast and how it was broadcasting the wrong information, then consider that if we live our lives as avatars, and again, I'm not suggesting you are, I'm certainly not, but there's a bit of a push to say, hey, you could be, this is cool, you'd be different, and it's all great and it's wonderful. Then who curates that? Because in that video about the clock being 3 minutes fast, I talked about a situation where I knew of a couple of IT guys who'd subtly intercepted, again, breaking all the rules and laws, etc., but subtly intercepted an email from one female colleague to a male colleague and tweaked it ever so slightly. And that began to distort that individual's life. And it could have had real world consequences. It ultimately didn't, thank goodness, but it could have had. And that always stuck with me. And when I see people like, I think it's Meta, again, I might be wrong, but it's one of the big companies. I know Apple are touting these glasses as well. And those are to aid what we look at. I appreciate some of them are overlays of the real world and give us extra information, and it's debatable whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But of course, I'd be churlish to say I couldn't see some of the benefits of that. But I'm talking about ones where you live like it's in a computer game, but it's like another world. And as I say, you can shop, you can interact with other avatars, you're this avatar. Then if those two guys all those years ago could tweak those little messages, then who's to say what couldn't be tweaked and changed? And you see it online now. Type a message in some platforms that you think is quite mild and broke community guidelines. Now, a lot of the time I agree with that, and other times I think, but hold on a second, that's not what I meant. The algorithm's rubbish. The bots are not thinking properly at all. But imagine that in a slightly bigger, more powerful way where we put all our life into being in that world. As I've said, that may sound a little bit too far out there. I hope it is. I hope it never happens. But I could see how it could. And that would be an extreme example of us being in a world, literally, where it was propaganda. It was one narrative, or the narratives were chosen for us. And so we must practice discernment, and we must look towards those people whose behaviors match the rhetoric, who at least appear to be humble. And we need to continue to monitor and to have a transparent dialogue with those people who are leaders, who we then can follow. We have to be careful of someone being put forward as the expert in everything. That's to me a little bit evangelical. That rings alarm bells. And we also have to do our own homework and always look out for, by reflex, jumping with the crowd onto that bandwagon. If your intuition says there's something wrong with that, then have a real good think about acting on reflex and just going with the herd, and take a step back and do a bit of research. So leaders need followers, those ones in position of power. The followers need to be discerning. If we're more discerning, ultimately, I believe we will get better leaders. Sounds like a good place to stop. Thank you very much for tuning in. Couldn't see any questions, so if you were asking, sorry, couldn't see them. Hope you have a happy and safe, well, Guy Fawkes, and also election result day. Bye for now.